Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the frozen north. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, because you're about to hear how Viking warriors managed to survive weeks at sea, surrounded by ice, soaked by freezing winds, without the one thing everyone else needed to stay alive: fire. Yeah, fire. That warm, crackling miracle we take for granted. The Vikings, not so much. Their ships were basically floating wooden refrigerators with dragon heads on the front. And yet somehow, these people who thought bathing once a week made you fancy, managed to cross the Arctic seas, raid half of Europe, and live to tell about it. Now, before we imagine them as some kind of frostbitten superheroes, let us take a step back and talk about what it really meant to live like a Viking in winter. Because if you think Scandinavian winter sounds cozy, you're probably picturing a log cabin, a fire crackling, maybe some mead in a mug. The Vikings didn't have that on ships. They had wind, water, and a level of damp misery that would make a modern camper cry after 10 minutes. So, how did they do it? To answer that, we have to start where all Viking discomfort begins, with the ships themselves. The iconic longship wasn't built for comfort. It was a masterpiece of mobility, yes, but also the opposite of insulated. Long and narrow, with an open deck that let icy spray pour right in. It was made to slice through waves, not keep anyone warm. The planks were thin, the gaps were sealed with animal hair and tar, and that's about it. Imagine standing in a wooden canoe, but it's the size of a bus, and it's -10 degrees. Now, you might think, why not just light a small fire on board? Well, because they weren't suicidal. Fire on a wooden ship was like juggling torches in a fireworks factory. One spark, and you're not warming up, you're lighting up. So instead, Viking warriors turned to the only heat source they had, themselves, and each other. Literally, a Viking crew huddled together under layers of wool and fur, packed tight like a group of frozen sardines. Their bodies became the central heating system. They de-wrapped themselves in thick cloaks, woven from wool that still had a bit of lanolin, the natural oil that made it water-resistant, and pull animal pelts over their shoulders. It wasn't stylish, but it worked. And sleeping arrangements. Let's just say, personal space was not a Viking concept. On long voyages, men slept on the deck, lying on top of their sea chests, or coils of rope, using whatever they could find for a pillow. They'd spread out animal hides beneath them to keep from freezing on the wet planks. If it was especially bad, they'd sleep in pairs, sharing body heat under a shared cloak. It wasn't romantic, it was survival. But that's not the whole story, because the Vikings didn't just rely on furs and friendship. They had an entire philosophy of warmth. To them, cold wasn't the enemy, it was a teacher. It was part of life, like wind, rain, and occasional blood feuds. From a young age, Viking children were toughened up to withstand the cold. Baths were taken in icy water. Outdoor chores were done year-round. The Norse sagas talk about warriors who laughed at frostbite, literally laughed, because showing weakness to the weather was basically like telling Odin you weren't worthy of Valhalla. So when it came time to sail to England or raid a monastery in Ireland, being cold wasn't new. It was normal. Still, there were tricks, the kind you don't read in most history books, because they sound too simple to matter, but they did. Vikings lined their clothes in layers, wool under wool. It trapped air between fibers, creating insulation. They greased their boots with animal fat to block out water. They even rubbed bear grease on exposed skin to seal in warmth, and possibly smell like a wet zoo. But who's judging? Their meals also helped. You can't stay warm if you're starving, and Vikings ate heavy. Dried fish, cured meats, porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in. They carried barrels of butter and cheese. Fat was their fuel, literally. High-calorie slow-burning, perfect for turning human bodies into tiny furnaces. And speaking of furnaces, Viking blood itself ran hot. Not in a poetic way, in a biological one. Generations living in Arctic conditions led to real physical adaptations: denser muscle, higher metabolism, and better circulation. Basically, nature built them like human space heaters, who could also swing axes. Now, before we go imagining these guys as frost-proof gods, remember, they still suffered. Frostbite, hypothermia, trench foot, all of it happened. Viking skeletons show damage from years of exposure to cold and moisture. Their bones tell stories of arthritis, infection, and exhaustion. They didn't thrive in the cold, they endured it, and enduring was kind of their whole thing. While most of medieval Europe shut down for winter, the Vikings saw it as just another season of opportunity. If the seas weren't frozen solid, they sailed. If they were, they walked across them. So when you hear stories about them rowing through icy fog, their beards crusted with frost, no fire in sight, it's not exaggeration. It's Tuesday, but there's something deeper here, something a little poetic, even under all that frostbite. Because the Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they belonged to it. Their gods lived in icy realms. Their myths were carved from snow and darkness. Even their afterlife, a place for warriors, wasn't tropical. It was a grand, endless hall lit by cold starlight and filled with the sound of battle. For the Norse, warmth wasn't about comfort. It was about defiance. The ability to stand in the freezing dark and say, "Yeah, I'm still here." And that, in the end, might be the real reason they didn't need fire. They were the fire. Let's drift a little further and see how these frostbitten sailors brought their chill resilience into their daily lives, from clothing to food to what passed for hygiene in a world where your beard might literally freeze mid. So, let us settle back into the icy waves of the North Sea, the Vikings' second home and worst roommate. We've talked about how they didn't have fire aboard their ships, which, again, feels like a major design flaw. But the Vikings weren't trying to build cruise liners. Their ships were war machines, floating extensions of their own toughness. And because comfort ranked somewhere below don't drown, they had to get creative when it came to keeping warm. Now, let's start with their fashion sense. If you picture a Viking, you probably imagine the cliché fur cloak, massive beard, possibly growling. That's not entirely wrong, but it was less epic movie hero and more smells like wet goat. Wool was the core of everything. It was warm, breathable, and if you didn't wash it too much, which to be clear, they didn't, the natural oils kept it somewhat waterproof. Viking tunics were thick, woven tightly, and often layered. A shirt, a tunic, a cloak, each trapping tiny pockets of air to keep body heat in. It was basically the medieval version of a thermal jacket, minus the zipper and plus some sheep smell. Underneath, they wore wool leggings or trousers, and over that, leg wraps, long strips of cloth wound tightly around the shins to block wind and stop the fabric from flapping around in battle. And then came the furs. Fox, bear, reindeer, anything with a pelt thick enough to make a difference. They didn't care about matching or luxury. It was function first. You'd see a chieftain wearing something like a half-bald wolf pelt. Not because it looked good, but because that wolf lost a fight, and now, apparently, it was a coat. Shoes were simple but clever. Vikings made them from cowhide or goatskin, stitched tightly, then stuffed with dry grass for insulation. Think of it as the original wool sock, except made of field debris, and it worked surprisingly well. Archaeologists have found Viking shoes with layers of straw still intact inside, showing how seriously they took their foot warmth. Now, you might wonder how all this helped during long voyages at sea, when everything was wet and freezing. The answer, it didn't, not at first. The moment you got hit by a wave, that glorious warmth turned to soggy misery. But Viking wool was special. It could absorb up to 30% of its weight in water without feeling wet. That meant, even soaked, it trapped some heat. So, yes, they were damp, but they weren't dead, which, for a Viking, was good enough. As for their hair and beards, those were practically frost sculptures by the end of a voyage. The sagas describe men returning from raids with ice in their beards and salt crusted into their eyebrows. Imagine trying to look intimidating while your moustache is frozen solid. But to them, it wasn't a problem. It was proof you'd survived another storm. Now, when they finally made landfall, that's when real warmth returned briefly. They'd haul their ships onto the beach, light fires, and let everything steam dry. Furs were spread out, cloaks hung near the flames, and, for a few hours, they could almost pretend they weren't living in an endless snowstorm. But there's something else worth mentioning here, something about Viking endurance that goes beyond clothing or food. Its attitude. Vikings didn't whine about the cold because, to them, discomfort wasn't something to fix, it was something to outlast. The Norse worldview was built on endurance. Every hardship was a test, and passing it proved your worth. They even had sayings for it. One old proverb roughly translates to, "There's no bad weather, only bad clothing," which is basically Scandinavian for, "suck it up." Still, even the toughest Vikings had limits. When storms hit hard, they'd beach their ships and camp onshore. That's when fire came back into the picture. Finally, they'd dig pits in the ground, line them with stones, and build fires there to keep heat low and steady. The smoke stayed hidden, the warmth stayed concentrated, and no one accidentally set their cloak on fire. These fires also doubled as makeshift kitchens. Vikings didn't survive on raw courage alone. They ate constantly. Their diets were heavy, fatty, and practical. Salted fish, dried meat, porridge thick with butter, and something called skaya, basically ancient Icelandic yogurt. They washed it down with ale or mead, because fresh water on a ship was rare, and honestly, drinking weak beer all day probably made being cold more tolerable. And it's easy to forget that Vikings were also traders, not just raiders. On long voyages, they carried barrels of dried food, jars of honey, and even kegs of fermented milk, which sounds horrifying, but hey, it was protein. Their bodies ran on fat, and that fat kept them warm. A modern dietitian would faint just looking at a Viking meal plan, but it worked. You burn through calories faster in cold weather, and the Vikings were constantly rowing, hauling, and fighting. They were human furnaces, stoked by bacon and stubbornness. When they slept, it was all about conserving body heat. They'd form a sort of huddle, cloaks pulled tight, sometimes even using shields to block the wind. A Viking longship at night wasn't quiet. It was a symphony of snoring, coughing, and creaking wood, drifting through the mist. And yet, in all that misery, they found pride. Because the colder it got, the more they proved they could handle it. And that kind of pride built the reputation we still remember today, the unstoppable ice-cold warriors of the north. But what happened when they weren't at sea? When winter came to their villages, and even the fjords froze solid? Let us drift inland for a while, into the snow-covered settlements, where Viking families huddled through the long, dark months, waiting for the sun to return. Imagine the longship pulled up on a frozen shore, the crew stumbling inland, stiff from rowing, faces wind-burned, clothes crusted with salt and frost. That's where we're headed now, back to where the Vikings actually lived. Because as brutal as the open sea was, winter at home wasn't exactly a spa retreat either. When the frost settled over Scandinavia, it didn't leave quietly. The sun vanished for weeks, sometimes months. Snow piled up on rooftops, rivers froze, and what little light there was barely rose above the horizon. The Vikings didn't fight the season, they retreated from it. Their houses were built for survival, not style. Long, low, and heavy with turf. Viking homes were basically glorified ovens, designed to trap heat and keep the wind out. The walls were made of timber, sometimes covered in sod for insulation. The roofs sagged low, stuffed with straw, and the doors were tiny, not because they liked crawling, but because every extra inch meant more cold air coming in. Step inside, and you'd enter a single long room filled with smoke, livestock, and family. Yes, livestock. In the dead of winter, animals were brought inside at night. Cows, sheep, goats, they all lived under the same roof as their owners. The heat from their bodies added to the warmth. And if you've ever wondered what authentic Viking aroma smelled like, well now you know. In the center of the hall burned the heart of Viking domestic life, the hearth. Unlike the ships, this was where fire finally made a proper appearance. A long, shallow pit, lined with stones, filled with glowing coals and crackling logs. Smoke drifted lazily upward, escaping through a hole in the roof that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Most Viking homes were smoky, dark, and filled with a constant haze that made everyone's eyes water. But no one complained, because that smoke was the only thing keeping them alive. The hearth wasn't just for heat, it was the center of everything. Meals were cooked over it, clothes dried beside it, families gathered around it to talk, eat, and occasionally bicker. Even their gods were thought to watch from the shadows beyond the flame. Above the fire, iron hooks hung from the rafters, suspending pots filled with stew or porridge. A typical winter meal might be something simple: barley cooked with bits of meat, maybe some dried fish, and whatever root vegetables hadn't frozen solid in storage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hearty. The kind of food that keeps you from dying when it's -20 outside. Vikings stored their supplies carefully. Every autumn they'd smoke and salt meat, dry fish, and bury root vegetables in cellars dug into the earth. Butter was stored in wooden barrels, sealed with animal fat. Mead was brewed in big clay jars, thick and sweet enough to warm you up from the inside. Winter wasn't just endured, it was planned for. And because daylight was scarce, evenings stretched endlessly, so they filled that time with stories. This was when sagas were born, not as written texts, but as fireside tales. Warriors recited battles, poets sang of gods, and families told stories that blended memory with myth. It wasn't entertainment so much as a way to keep the dark from swallowing them. Now, for all their toughness, even Vikings had soft spots. During the deepest parts of winter, festivals like Yule offered a break from the monotony. For 12 nights, people feasted, drank, and tried to forget that everything outside was frozen solid. Fires burned high, offerings were made to the gods, and yes, there was probably some questionable dancing involved. But in between the feasting and storytelling, Viking life indoors was slow, cold, and repetitive. People mended clothes, carved wood, sharpened weapons, and waited for the light to return. And speaking of clothes, what they wore inside was just as layered as what they wore outside. Heavy tunics, cloaks, woolen caps. They even had primitive mittens, because apparently, even legendary raiders didn't like cold fingers. At night, they slept on raised wooden platforms covered in straw and hides. Families often shared beds to conserve warmth. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Survival was, and since the hearth burned low overnight, most Viking nights were spent half awake, huddled under layers, listening to the wind claw at the walls. But all that cold, smoke, and darkness built a kind of strength, a quiet endurance that shaped their culture. Because when you spend half the year in near-freezing gloom, you learn to value light, warmth, and community. It was on just about surviving the cold. It was about not letting it crush your spirit. By the time spring thawed the fjords, Vikings were more than ready to sail again, restless, strong, and itching to move. You can almost picture them stepping out of their smoky houses, blinking in the weak sunlight, looking at the half-frozen sea, and saying, "All right, let's go raid someone." But before we sail again, there's one last piece of the puzzle, the spiritual side of all this. The Norse didn't just endure the cold physically, they found meaning in it. Let's ease into that next, how the freezing Norse shaped their gods, their myths, and their idea of what it meant to live and die in a world of endless winter. Still drifting with me through the chill? Good, because now we're stepping into something deeper than frozen seas and smoky longhouses. The Viking mind, the way they thought about cold. For the Norse winter wasn't just a season, it was a personality, ancient, powerful, and always watching. In their mythology, cold was one of the first things that ever existed. Literally, before the world began, there was nothing but fire and ice. In the Old Norse creation myth, the universe started with a void called Gittungop. On one side burned the fiery realm of Muspelheim, on the other side, the frozen wasteland of Niflheim. When the heat and cold met in that endless gap, they didn't cancel each other out, they made life. Out of melting ice came the first being, Ymir, a frost giant. So, in a way, the Vikings believed they were all descendants of ice. Not a bad origin story for people who thrived in the coldest corners of the world. And that idea, that frost wasn't just an enemy, but an ancestor, shaped everything about how they saw nature. The cold wasn't something to curse, it was something to respect. In Norse mythology, most of the gods actually lived in cold realms. Asgard wasn't exactly tropical. Even Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, wasn't about comfort, it was about glory, mead, and eternal battle. Warmth came from firelight and fellowship, not from the weather. Then there were the frost giants, or Jotnar. They weren't villains in the cartoonish sense. They were older, raw, powers of nature, chaotic, unshaped, and often wiser than the gods who fought them. The frost giants were the embodiment of the North itself, beautiful, deadly, and impossible to tame. So when Vikings faced blizzards or endless nights, it wasn't just weather, it was spiritual. It was the world reminding them of their origins, that humanity came from ice, and one day it would return to it. That idea reached its peak in the myth of Ragnarok, the end of everything. When the world would freeze, the sun would vanish, and endless winter would return. Not just a bad winter Fimbulvita, the great winter, 3 years of snow, no summer in between. Crops fail, families starve, and even the gods can't stop it. Sound familiar? To a Viking farmer, that wasn't just a prophecy, it was Tuesday again. Every harsh season was a rehearsal for the apocalypse. But there's something almost comforting about that. The The Vikings didn't fear the cold because they believed it was part of the cycle. Warmth never lasted, and neither did suffering. Everything froze, everything melted, everything started over. And that's what gave them their strange calm. This acceptance that life was temporary, harsh, and still worth living. Now, if you were to sit beside a Viking hearth in midwinter, let us say around the 9th century, you'd probably hear these stories being told. The crackle of the fire, the flicker of orange on faces wrapped in wool, the sound of wind against the turf roof. Outside, the world is pitch black, the stars like shards of ice. Inside, someone telling the story of Emir's body being turned into the earth, his flesh becoming soil, his bones mountains, his skull the sky. And everyone just nods, because that's the world they lived in, made from frost, shaped by gods, and destined to end in snow. Even their daily routines echoed that belief. Fire was sacred, but it was never taken for granted. The hearth flame was kept alive through the night, not just for warmth, but as a symbol of endurance. If it went out, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was bad luck. Families guarded their embers like treasure. Some even carried coals wrapped in moss when moving between homes, to ensure the same fire lived on in the new place. That small, glowing flame was their defiance against the endless cold, their way of saying, "We may have come from ice, but we carry heat now." And when someone died in winter, their burial often included fire too. Cremation was common among Vikings, and pyres lit up the dark horizon like temporary suns. The body burned, smoke rose toward the stars, and for a moment, it was as if warmth had returned to the sky. It's poetic, in a grim sort of way. Even in death, they sought balance between fire and frost. And maybe that's the real truth behind how they kept warm without fire. It wasn't just physical, it was cultural, spiritual, almost stubborn. The warmth was in their stories, their laughter, their survival through yet another night. Because for a Viking, the goal was never comfort, it was endurance. To keep living in a world that didn't really want you to sail frozen seas and call it freedom. And somehow, that mindset carried them across half the known world, from Norway to Newfoundland, powered mostly by courage, codfish, and a total disregard for weather reports. So the next time you complain about being cold, just remember, there were once men who crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, wrapped in damp wool, with frozen beards, and thought, "Hey, not bad." And that's the cold truth. We've sailed through icy seas, huddled in smoky halls, and wandered through the frozen halls of Norse myth. Now, let's slow down for the last stretch, the quiet part, the part where the cold settles, the wind fades, and all that's left is the hum of survival. If there's one thing that stands out about Viking life, it's that they didn't chase comfort. They didn't try to control the cold, they learned to move with it. It was less about conquering nature, more about sinking with it, even when it hurt. Modern people talk about resilience like it's a mindset. The Vikings didn't have a word for it, they just lived it. When the sea froze, they waited. When food ran low, they stretched it. When storms hit, they held the ship together with their bare hands and swore at the sky until it passed. And somehow, they kept going. It's easy to romanticize them, to picture endless adventure, horns on helmets, which, by the way, weren't real, and fiery raids. But the truth is quieter. Most of Viking life wasn't battle, it was survival. Long nights, aching joints, damp clothes, and the dull repetition of keeping things going one more day. There's something strangely peaceful about that, because in a way, that's what all of human history is, one long story of people figuring out how to stay warm, stay fed, and stay alive in a world that doesn't make it easy. The Vikings just did it with more snow and fewer blankets. When you think about them out there on the North Sea, rowing through sleet, beards frozen into spikes, it's hard not to feel a bit of respect. They didn't have technology or luxury, just wool, wood, and willpower. And somehow, that was enough. Their ships, so open and exposed, were symbols of that attitude. They weren't shelters, they were statements. "We'll take the world as it is," those longships said, "and still make it ours." And maybe that's the real warmth that kept them going. Not fire, not fur, but purpose. Every time they set sail, it wasn't just for plunder or glory. It was proof that they could outlast the ice, the wind, the endless dark. Proof that even when the world froze around them, they could still move. If you look closely, that same spirit lingers in the lands they left behind. In modern Scandinavia, where winters are still long, and people still find beauty in the cold, candles in every window, fires burning low, warm light against black nights, the same balance of frost and flame that their ancestors lived by. It's funny, isn't it? Thousands of years later, and the lesson's still the same. You don't need to escape the cold. You just need to carry your own warmth through it. That's what the Vikings did on ships without fires, in homes filled with smoke, in stories that glowed brighter than any hearth. They took the cold truth of the world and made it theirs. So tonight, as we leave their frozen seas behind, maybe take that with you. The idea that warmth doesn't have to come from flames or sunlight. Sometimes it comes from grit, from people sitting close, from refusing to give up, even when everything around you says you should. And if you close your eyes now, maybe you can almost hear it, the sound of oars dipping into dark water, the whisper of wind through the rigging, and the slow, steady rhythm of men who carried their fire inside them. The Vikings never needed heat. They were the heat. Sleep well, and stay warm.